Thank you for this very kind introduction. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the conveners of the World Strategy Forum for inviting me here, and not least for organizing everything so neatly and perfectly. It is a great pleasure for me to be here in Seoul and be able to grasp some of the moments of the spirit of your country. The country I come from, Germany, and your country, Korea, share a lot of history in the past decades. Both have been recast in the 1940s and 1950s under the global pressure of the emerging Cold War. Germany and Korea have both been politically divided into a communist and a capitalist part, the latter heavily supported and protected by the United States. While Germans have been lucky to reunite in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Empire some 20 years ago, and now live in a country that is united, free and democratic at the same time, Koreans have not been as fortunate so far. However, it is my deep persuasion as a political analyst and as a historian that ultimately this division will not be able to last. There are more specific links and shared experiences between Germany and South Korea over the past half-century, and two of them stand out. First of all, it is the experience of democratization. Since the 1980s in particular, South Korea has gone an impressive way of becoming a democratic society in whatever meaning of this concept, in terms of a democratic political constitution, as a representative and parliamentary democracy, as well as in the broader terms of what Karl Popper so aptly called the open society, a society of freedom for the individual, of tolerance, respect and possibilities. Germany had taken up its path into democracy in the late 1940s in the West and had become an open society fully by the 1960s and 1970s. Eventually, the fall of the wall and reunification in 1989-1990 completed this German march into democratization. Secondly, still speaking about the parallel paths of the two countries, we share a history of capitalist expansion, of the growth of market economies, and of mass prosperity becoming ever more widespread. True, Germany had been a highly developed country and economy already a century ago. Indeed, back then, shortly before World War I, Germany was competing only with the United States for global economic leadership. But only the boom period after World War II soared West Germany into a full-blown market society and a middle-class consumer society at the same time. Growth rates had been exceptionally high from the 1950s into the 1970s. Not much later, it was South Korea, together with other Asian economies, that embarked on an impressive journey of capitalist growth and social transformation, which turned your country into one of the leading economies of the world. South Korea's membership in the G20 and its hosting the G20 summit in a few months is a recognition of this success and part of a story that I'm sure is not yet over, although South Korea's economy and society is facing new challenges, both global and domestic, as we've just heard in the keynote address. The global challenge, of course, is clearly visible in the financial and economic crisis since 2008, and the reaction to which the G20 was strengthened, thereby acknowledging the rising power of the emerging economies. The crisis of the past 2 years has hit Europe, and indeed Germany, particularly hard. In the past weeks, the near breakdown of financial markets and the resulting crisis in manufacturing and international trade has been superseded by the crisis of the joint European currency, the euro, which in turn mostly resulted from public debts that had come out of control in Greece and other countries on the southern periphery of Europe. I will return to this problem later. The perhaps most striking fact about recent economic development in Europe, however, is not the economy, but is in society and culture. Although many of the worst expectations of the winter of 2008 have not come true, And although the market drop in growth has not led into widespread and acute poverty, as was the case with the most dramatic economic crisis in world history since then, the Great Depression of the 1930s, trust in capitalism and in the ability of market societies to provide prosperity and security for the future is at a historical low. In popular opinion, as well as in educated and academic circles, the near end of capitalism has been foreseen in a strange mixture of longing and apprehension. In ways that seemed forgotten already, many people have started again to seek for principal alternatives to capitalism, out of a deep conviction that the system of modern capitalism is an illness that has to be cured, with poverty, an increasing gap between the rich and the poor, and the inability to provide security and prosperity in the future being the symptoms. Neo-socialist political parties, such as the German Left Party, flourish in polls and elections. What do we make of this? Is that an obscure peculiarity of Germany or of whole Europe, to be explained either by the socialist legacy of Soviet-style communism or by the fact that capitalism in Europe, the region where it was born many hundred years ago, is nearing the end of its life cycle? But what kind of economy and society would follow capitalism? What indeed are the global prospects for the future of capitalism? This is where my talk only really begins. I would like to share my thoughts with you in 3 steps. First, as I'm originally trained as a historian, I will take a brief look at the history of capitalism, not for its own sake. To be aware of the long history of capitalism is extremely helpful, I shall argue, for realistically assessing the potential development in the future. A short historical journey also makes clear that although the core of capitalism is no doubt in the instrument of markets and in the possibility of individuals to freely move and act on markets, there is more to capitalism than that. Not accidentally have I started this speech by referring to the inextricably linked success stories of economic growth and democratization in both Germany and South Korea. Considering capitalism, therefore, must include its fringe benefits that we often tend to overlook in times of economic crisis. On the other hand, not all the problems we are trying to grapple with in recent years can easily be attributed to capitalism or to the malfunction of markets. In order to understand the current crisis, we must take other factors into account outside the economy proper, especially some structural changes in society and government. Capitalism often is a scapegoat for other miseries because markets function as indicators of weaknesses elsewhere. It is, in other words, the bearer of bad news whom you shouldn't hit just because he's telling you about the problems. In the second part of my talk, therefore, I will address some broader implications of the current crisis in the triangle of society, government, and the economy. I will argue that in many ways we have to solve other than purely economic problems, such as the regulation of financial markets, if we want to reach a future of security and prosperity. This will lead us finally to the third step of my thoughts, which is about the future prospects of capitalism. Will we see a new type of capitalism emerge from the crisis? And what is the role of national governments and of international cooperation in it? What about the possibility of capitalism without growth, a much discussed option as growth rates in the more mature capitalist countries in the North Atlantic region have slowed down, and questions of sustainability and ecological responsibility have come to the fore. In the end, I hope I will not have bored you with my speech, although you might find the message not particularly thrilling. No, there will be no blueprint for a fundamentally new order of economy and society as I close my speech. And that's simply because I'm convinced this is not the option. It won't help us much to look for sensationalist or utopian prophecies of the future. It might help us to realistically assess where we come from and where we are heading, and to act in a firm manner on those grounds. The recent crisis of financial markets is sometimes perceived, ladies and gentlemen, as if it would signal the sunset of capitalism. The decades from the late 1970s and early 1980s, starting with Margaret Thatcher's Britain and Ronald Reagan's America, shifted the course of economic policies towards the deregulation of markets. Supply-sided economics, and at the same time started to shift the whole economy from a primacy in manufacturing to a primacy in financial markets. That is, from producing first to speculating first. As this has steered the course of capitalism away from healthier tracks, often associated with the Keynesian period of the post-war decades, it is small wonder that false promises would not last and the whole system collapse. Or so the story often goes. Now, let there be no misunderstanding. I do not want to diminish the severity of the crisis that we have seen in the past 2 years, although regional perspectives on that crisis differ enormously, and Europe seems hardest hit both economically and in a mental shock, similar to that which East Asia has already suffered in 1997-98. But the story so told about a kind of illusionary expansion of capitalism is incomplete. In a global perspective, the 1980s marked perhaps not so much the transition from a Keynesian to a neoliberal paradigm, but first and foremost the take-off phase in a new period of global expansion of capitalism. Be it in Latin America or in East Asia, not least in the People's Republic of China, be it in southern European countries such as Spain or Portugal, or be it in the collapse of the centrally planned economies of the former Soviet bloc and the ensuing emergence of new market economies in Central and Eastern Europe. The expansion of market economies around the world is what fundamentally shaped the past 3 decades. Not everywhere did the new freedom of markets, of entrepreneurs as well as consumers, coincide with gains in personal and political freedom, or with the transformation of authoritarian political regimes. China is, of course, the case in point, although one should not overlook the more subtle political and cultural changes under the firmly kept structures of Communist Party rule. But on the other hand, the recent period of market expansion not accidentally overlaps with what the famous political scientist Samuel P. Huntington called the global third wave of 20th century democratization of the world. It is also not accidental that a major technological revolution has gone along with those economic and political trends, namely the revolution in information and communication triggered by the computer, the mobile phone, and the internet. Without these technological possibilities, the expansion in space and the acceleration in time of trading goods, shares, and derivatives is hardly imaginable. And in that sense, the recent financial crisis also appears to be a product of the technological revolution. What we tend to forget, however, is that the very same processes have also fundamentally transformed everyday lives of millions, of billions even, of people, and that for several hundred millions of them, the history of capitalist expansion since the 1980s is a history of their personal prosperity, their rise from the margins of society to modest prosperity and to individual participation in global social networks as well as in consumer markets. Not only national economies, but also individual persons, families and households may be hard hit by the crisis, even by the loss of a job or the foreclosure of the private home. And yet the losses of the past 2 years far and away haven't eaten up the gains the world has made through the proliferation of markets in the past 3 decades. If we extend our perspective from just 3 decades to more than 3 centuries for a moment, skepticism about a fatal view on capitalism bound for decline and dissolution mounts further. For most corners of the world, capitalism and market economy are indeed quite recent arrivals. However, their roots date back to, if not ingenious financial inventions in the Middle Ages, then at least to the beginning emergence of market economies in some small pockets of Europe, such as the Netherlands, in the 17th century. Now, it would be far too simple to make a point about the longevity of capitalism, although indeed we should be careful to forecast the end of an economic regime that has lasted so long. There is even some hubris sometimes in the idea that it is us who should be the witnesses of such a major transformation. No, I would rather like to hint at the remarkable resiliency and flexibility that capitalism has shown over the course of the past 3 centuries. Even in Western Europe, with its quite long-standing tradition of market economies, many people tend to believe that capitalism originated with the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century and with the mass manufacturing of goods in large factories. The loss of manufacturing industries, as has happened in the United States and Western Europe since the 1970s, at the expense of Asian countries such as South Korea, may then be misread as the beginning demise of capitalism. But in reality, capitalism is a chameleon. It has been able to adapt to an enormous variety of not only cultural environments and traditions, but also technological regimes and social structures. Indeed, it is hard to imagine that the seeds of capitalism were growing at a time when people could only travel in horse carriages or sail the sea, and when the traveling of information about several hundred kilometers was a matter of days, if not weeks or months. Nevertheless, the roots of capitalism are in long-distance trading, whereas everyday economic activity on farms, in villages and small cities remained in the framework of self-sufficiency and barter often into the 20th century. After the first stages of capitalism in long-distance trading of luxury goods, the next territory conquered by markets was the agrarian economy. The 18th century saw the advent of agrarian capitalism, in which farms were increasingly drawn into national or even international networks of trade and for profit production. Major technological innovations only became part of the capitalist mechanism with the 19th century, as energy and power could be delivered by machinery instead of nature or manpower. Again, a century later, the service economy began to challenge the dominance of industrial capitalism and once more fundamentally reshaped labor markets as well as the global distribution of market functions. The late 20th and early 21st centuries, as already mentioned and as we all know, is again driven by technological innovation and a new stage in the communication revolution. It is an astonishing fact, indeed, that the regime of markets had been able to coexist with this variety of technological and social circumstances. Apparently, the basic principles of market societies are much more fundamental than we sometimes tend to think. Without a doubt, they rest in the promise of prosperity that continues to drive human ambitions and in the principle of the individual pursuit of happiness, to borrow a phrase from the American Declaration of Independence. Given that long chain and the varieties of capitalism, from trader and agrarian to industrial and services capitalism, it is important to note that the emergence of new types or regimes of capitalism has never completely destroyed the older or previous ones. Agrarian capitalism has not been rendered obsolete by the Industrial Revolution. And despite an enormous surge in the services sector, of all advanced economies, the capitalist manufacturing of goods in machine-equipped factories, be it textiles or cars or computers, has not vanished and certainly won't in the near future. It might even be argued that the recent emphasis in capitalism on global trade, on speculation with futures, reminds of its very first phases in the 17th century. Over the past 2 years, we have quite often heard about the Dutch tulip fever of the 1630s, a speculative bubble that dramatically burst in 1637. How do we explain the variability and flexibility of capitalism? Apparently, a market-based economy driven by individual freedom of property and pursuit of profit is closely related to fundamental principles of modern society that so far we haven't given away, and as far as I can see, are not likely to do so as a response of the recent crisis. Let me very briefly just point out 3 very different aspects of those side effects of capitalism. First of all, as already mentioned in my introduction, the connection between market economies and open democratic societies is as obvious as it is complicated. It is obvious from a historical viewpoint in the common roots of capitalism and democratic individualism in the West, particularly in the United States during the 18th and 19th centuries. The close link between an open economy and an open polity also strikes us as an empirical fact today. All democratic nations today confess to the fundamental principles of market capitalism, even if they sometimes, as do the Scandinavian countries, for example, value government regulation very highly and tax income and property at extremely high rates. The reverse, however, is equally obvious, also not the case. Capitalism may be compatible with authoritarian regimes, with limitations to individual freedom, freedom of the press, or religious freedom. This dubious marriage of free markets and unfree individuals in the course of the past 100 years alone has plagued nearly all regions of the world, from Europe to Latin America and East Asia. The case of today's China is, of course, most significant for the current prospects of capitalism and democracy. Even though China seems politically quite stable, it is hard to deny that its enormous market revolution since the 1980s has also transformed Chinese society and opened up individual liberties and opportunities nearly everywhere, except for the very core of a democratic regime and individual political liberty. Markets don't like traditional hierarchies in societies. The mechanisms of trade, they rely on rational and egalitarian principles, and the freedom of individual choice may hardly be confined to just economic choices as a tradesperson or as a consumer. The fall of the communist regimes in Europe 2 decades ago has clearly demonstrated the scope of the principle of freedom. In none of the new democratic countries was it possible or even imaginable to maintain a centrally planned economy in the face of political liberty. Therefore, in the interest of further spread of democracy, we should advocate free markets and free trade. We should pursue mobility and open borders. As democracy is not an automatic consequence of capitalism, however, we should use the forums of international economic cooperation, such as G20, not just for the advancement of economic prosperity or for smoothing economic policies among nations, but also for reminding the world that the principles of market capitalism, individualism, liberty, pluralism, tolerance, and respect ought to be indivisible. Capitalism, as we've said, is a chameleon, adaptable to a wide variety of cultural and technological circumstances. There is one thing, however, that capitalism definitely doesn't like and cannot exist with, and that is a static, a stable, a frozen environment. Hence, my second point is about the inextricable link between capitalism and dynamics, between capitalism and innovation. Without the institutional context of capitalism and market societies, inventions and all sorts of intelligent ideas will spread much more slowly. Technological advancements will not be converted into mechanisms of production or be spread to consumers. Indeed, inventions and advancements are much rarer in non-capitalist environments. In comparison with capitalism, the inability of communist economies to produce innovation is particularly striking. The original worldview of communism certainly is one of transformation. And nearly all communist leaders, starting with Karl Marx, have emphasized the role of modern technology for revolutionary society. And yet communist societies have never been able to find a substitute for the capitalist mechanisms of competition, of individual ambition and achievement. The fundamental disability to produce new ideas and new things resulted in old-fashioned technological standards, in neglected urban landscapes, and ultimately in the lack of prosperity for the majority of the population. Now it may be argued that capitalism's preference for the new, its never being content with the status quo, does come at a cost. Instead of stability, there is often insecurity. Traditional lifestyles are being constantly challenged. Families and individuals are challenged into risks and flexibility. Economically, the insatiable hunger for innovation knows not only winners but also losers. Firms that lack the competitive edge go bankrupt and vanish from the market. Even whole industries decline as their products have become outdated by new ones, often leaving hundreds of thousands of workers unemployed and in search for a new job. In the 1940s, the famous economist Joseph Schumpeter coined the term creative destruction, and made this a centerpiece of his definition of capitalism. More than half a century later, many people in Europe in particular are not so sure anymore whether they welcome constant innovation, new technologies and the permanent social change that results from this. As has been the case with capitalism since its beginnings, the leadership role in innovation has been shifting across regions and continents. America has maintained an astonishingly high potential of dynamics and innovation, thanks to its enormous cultural creativity and its constant influx of migrants. Europe, in contrast, is struggling and has been overtaken by East Asia, including South Korea. That is certainly something your country can be proud of, but it must also be understood as a call to global responsibility. My third point, still talking about the indispensable side effects of capitalism, may be surprising, given what I just said about the risky nature of capitalism, and also given the current situation in the aftermath of the giant financial crisis, partly rooted in excessive speculation with futures and derivatives. Capitalism still provides us with quite effective mechanisms for the calculation of the future. Despite this lack of inherent stability, market institutions support the economy and indeed each and every individual person in making an unclear future more reliable and regular. Capitalism fundamentally is about evaluating prospects for the future, is about trading expectations. It seems to me that those mechanisms are often too little understood in current political opinion about the financial crisis and possible remedies that seek to restrict market action and, in a very diffuse sense, any kind of speculation. An airline company, for example, will want to secure kerosene at an acceptable price 1 year from now. Of course, nobody knows what the market price for kerosene then will be. The company is betting on the future and may in the end fare better or worse with its contract. However, this kind of dealing with the future will make prices better calculable and thereby benefit the customer. As important as it is to better understand the technical instruments used on modern markets in the wake of the financial crisis, we ought to be careful not to damage the principal function of those instruments, which is indeed security and reliability. In European public opinion today, there is widespread uneasiness about the fact that on modern markets, contracts are bought by someone who doesn't actually need the commodities behind it. But why should not someone buy the airline's kerosene contract in the expectation of reselling it at a better price in the future? As important as transparency of markets are, the restriction of markets may be dangerous and in fact make our future less rather than more secure. Financial markets are indicators for changes in expectations about the future. Therefore, we shouldn't be angry about the thermometer that warns us about a fever, but rather think about the cures for the illness. This is all the more important since in modern societies, caring for the future has become a central concern, not just for companies, but for individual persons, compared to previous times in history. In pre-capitalist times, even far into the 19th century, the opportunities for caring for one's own future were extremely limited. The best insurance was to have children who support you when you grow old or sick and couldn't make a living of your own. Today, many people even don't have children in the first place and therefore have to rely on building a material future for themselves by saving and investing money in markets. Caring for the future also was hardly possible in times when 80% or more of the population just barely made their living, earning enough to buy just today's food and other essentials. The revolution in general prosperity since the 20th century, in other words, has enormously expanded the economics of the future, because hundreds of millions of people have spare resources that they want to keep for the next decades, be it for their own retirement or for the betterment of the lives of their children. Markets are fluid and volatile, but alternative institutions for dealing with the future are rare. The ambivalence of capitalism, therefore, again, is hard to deny. And yet, chances are that we are better off inside capitalism than we would be in some diffuse territory beyond it. The deep crisis of 2008-2009, ladies and gentlemen, came at a time when many people had almost forgotten what a severe economic downturn really means. In Germany, in all of Europe, indeed in the whole North Atlantic region, including the United States, memories of the Great Depression of the 1930s filled the newspapers. The memories of a crisis that only few persons could actually personally remember. The series of crises at the end of the European golden age of post-war boom in the 1970s, mostly associated with dramatically rising oil prices, had sent warnings and had temporarily halted economic growth, but hardly did the gross national product drop by several percentage points, as had been the case last year. The Asian experience is, of course, different, with the crisis and recession of 1997 only a decade away. Maybe that recent memory of the volatility of market capitalism has helped Asian countries to steer more successfully and also more confidently through difficult times than was the case in Europe. There can be no doubt that capitalism and crisis belong closely together. Before market economies took hold, the material well-being of nations depended on the cycles and chances of nature. A natural disaster such as the eruption of a volcano, an earthquake, or just a rainy or cold summer might have catastrophic effects for the production of foodstuffs and have millions of people starve. The Irish famine of the 1840s, caused by a potato disease, still is the most striking example of this. A century later, the rhythms of boom and bust, miraculously inherent in capitalism, shaped the fortunes of people in advanced industrial economies. The social effects were still quite devastating, as in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Millions of workers in the United States and Germany, the two countries hardest hit by the crisis, lost their job without much chances of unemployment benefits. Parents did not know how to feed their children, families lost their homes and migrated elsewhere, carrying only some bags of personal items. It is not to diminish the economic severity of the current economic crisis if we remember those catastrophic social consequences during the 1930s. Compared to 80 years ago, in most regions of the world, the financial crisis and recession of 2008 and 2009 has been a crisis in relative luxury, buffered by a much higher standard of living, by the previous accumulation of personal resources, and not least by government subsidies, be it as welfare benefits for the unemployment, as tax credits, or even in the form of direct subsidies that many European countries gave out if you bought, for example, a new car, not to mention the billions of dollars or euros that went into the stabilization of the banking industry. In many ways, therefore, we have the potentials today to deal with severe economic crisis in a much more relaxed way than at any time in history. There is a long way to go before even a sharp and lasting economic downturn would endanger the elementary physical well-being in developed countries. At the same time, we should be careful not to feel all too relaxed about this. Not only maybe the long-term effects of crisis affect our prosperity and security in the future. It may also be argued that the recent crisis must be understood as a signal for deeper problems in the organization of modern societies. That is to say, the crisis in the functioning and control of financial markets. It is a reflection of much wider transformation in several aspects of state and society, which in turn means addressing the crisis cannot stop by the reform of financial institutions or with better governmental or international control of markets. Addressing the crisis means addressing some of the larger problems that we have handled rather carelessly so far. What is it that I'm talking about? Let me very briefly sketch 3 examples. First, the demography of changing and aging society. Second, the ambivalent effects of welfare state expansion. And third, the situation of public debt. The demographic situation of advanced industrial societies has been a major issue in public debate in the past decade. The situation seems clear. As fertility rates have been dropping sharply after the baby boom generations, and as life expectancy is rising with better nutrition and medical care, societies are getting older, shifting their balance towards the retired population. Moreover, the overall population may start to shrink instead of grow, as more people die than are newborn, as is actually already the case in many European countries. Indeed, the general picture comes with important regional variations. Europe, obviously, is the pioneer of aging and shrinking societies, but East Asia, as we've just heard in the previous address, is likely to follow that same pattern soon, be it as a result of reproductive politics, as in China, or in adaptation to Western cultural styles. The United States is a conspicuous exception in the developed world and will probably remain so for at least several decades, with a relatively young and, most important, dynamically growing population far into the 21st century. What we are not so sure about is the economic effects of demographic change. But it is clear already that a smaller number of working population will have to pay and care for a greater number of non-working, mostly elderly population. This is not just a strain on the distributive mechanisms of the welfare state, as we have been aware for some time. In addition, the recent financial crisis has pointed to the enormous monetary stakes of an aging population and its impact on markets. Never before in history have so many relatively affluent people commanded over so many financial assets in preparation for their retirement life? The fact that financial markets and products have gained economic importance vis-à-vis the manufacturing economy in recent decades is, in other words, a direct consequence of major demographic trends in connection with relative prosperity of the post-war generations. As these trends are certain to continue, we should pay much more attention to them instead of just blaming pension funds and other investors for attempting to secure profits on their capital. And I haven't even touched upon one other aspect, namely the possible effects of aging on a society's ability for cultural creativity and economic innovation. A second issue, probably no less influential, is the effects of the welfare state on the future of capitalism and on its propensity for crisis. To be sure, the expansion of the welfare state in the 20th century has had a massively healthy influence on the development of market societies and economies. Fundamentally, the welfare state has been the chief instrument, especially in Europe, for integrating the working classes into capitalist societies and for winning their political support. Fundamental opposition to market economies has been calmed down through welfare state arrangements. Moreover, the welfare state in the Keynesian period of Western capitalism, in particular that is in the middle decades of the 20th century, has become an indispensable actor on the market and often has been able to intervene in the cycles of capitalism in a way that moderated and alleviated the potential for crisis, for example, through deficit spending in public infrastructures. However, the disadvantages or critical aspects of welfare regimes in the long run are also up for discussion. They include, though difficult to grasp, cultural effects, as one can argue that welfare cushioning beyond a certain level is making individuals and whole societies less ambitious and dynamic. In economic terms, governments are not always the best actors on markets, as has been demonstrated by the involvement of government-controlled financial institutions in the recent crisis in Germany and, most of all, probably in the United States, with the collapse of the public mortgage institutions Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The politics of cheap money for private homes in the United States may even be considered a cornerstone of the middle-class welfare regime typical for this country, and therefore, beyond the breakdown of financial institutions, also signaled a crisis of a specific type of social policy that had run out of control. Finally, the most obvious effect of the expansion of welfare regimes has been the growth of public debt in Western nations since the 1970s. Although in previous times in history, crisis in state financing had helped to topple regimes and bring about revolutions, as in the case of France in the 1780s, the accumulation of public debt in the late 20th century for a long time didn't seem to bother very many people, including economists. That, of course, has fundamentally changed now, and the current situation in Europe, with states such as Greece almost declaring bankruptcy, may be the final exclamation mark that things cannot go on like this. For about a decade now, the problem of public debt has been discussed chiefly in the light of responsibility vis-à-vis future generations who would have to pay off the debts their parents and grandparents have incurred. Indeed, the issue of public debt must be regarded a moral issue, an issue of sustainability in fundamental economic patterns. In many ways, we have grown used to living beyond our possibilities and at the expense of our children and grandchildren. The recent crisis hasn't proven this wrong, but has added a dramatic aspect to the picture. The economic consequences of public debt do not lurk sometime in the future for our children and grandchildren, but have caught us right now. In the light of the European debt and currency crisis of the past weeks, it sounds rather ironic that as an answer to the first wave of the financial crisis and economic recession in the winter of 2008 and 9, public spending in many countries had risen to record highs, politically justified by a widely believed theory about the return of Keynesianism. According to that theory, the crisis was the final result of a neoliberal overstretch and had effectively ended the reign of the neoliberal paradigm. A little more than a year later, the talk about the return of Keynesianism in Europe is practically dead again. It has turned out that the danger of public debt is real, and that neoliberalism never just was the problem to be solved, but at least as much an answer to much more serious imbalances in the public economy. This brings me to the third and conclusive part of my talk. What are the future prospects for capitalism? Is the recent financial crisis final proof that this economic system is doomed for failure? Or will capitalism continue to flourish, sometimes shaken and even transformed by crisis, but ultimately stand firm, and be it just for the lack of alternatives? As we have seen so far, the latter is much more likely. From a bird's eye view, the history of the last few decades alone has been a success story for capitalism and the expansion of market societies. Towards the end of the 1980s, the only alternative that existed on a global scale, the organization of complex economies according to the socialist model of centrally planning, has virtually disappeared in two quite different ways. In the context of a political revolution of freedom and democracy in the former Soviet Empire of Europe, and without that political change, but economically hardly less revolutionary, in China since the rule of Deng Xiaoping. Other major regions on the globe have been drawn into the empire of market in a more evolutionary, yet hardly less dramatic manner. Greater parts of Latin America, especially the emerging giant of Brazil, the largest democracy in the world and its second most populous nation, India, and not least the dynamic economies of East and Southeast Asia, with South Korea leading their way. What's next, one might ask? Two regions, two world civilizations, in the sense of Samuel Huntington, deserve particular attention for the next half-century to come. The Islamic belt that stretches from Northwest Africa to the Middle East and in some ways also to Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. In both regions, cultural contexts and political preconditions have so far not allowed the market economy to make larger inroads into traditional ways of life, with political instability and corruption being at least as important as a barrier against the intrusion of the market as cultural and religious enmities supported by Islamic fundamentalism. Again, however, the absence of alternative regimes of economic organization is striking. Therefore, it is close to certain that market capitalism will eventually also triumph in Africa and Islamic West Asia. Maybe our children and grandchildren will even see some countries in those areas become the dynamic tigers of global capitalism in the mid to late 21st century, leaving the then mature economies of East Asia behind them as new centers of growth and manufacturing. Hence, the future of capitalism will continue to be characterized by transitional cycles of innovation, growth, and maturity. The current European perspective on capitalism, the view that this economic system is finally coming to an end, with the crisis of 2008 a harbinger of its eventual demise, is largely due to a regional, one might even say a provincial perspective. Europe has been losing weight in the global economy, and this process of relative decline will without any doubt continue, even if we take the potential for growth in the new market economies of Central and Eastern Europe into account. It is, of course, nice to make ambitious claims, as the European Union did with its Lisbon strategy of 2000, demanding that Europe be the most dynamic and most competitive economic area in the world by 2010, that is today. Reality has proven different. As we have reached the year 2010, the winner in that race clearly is East Asia. Or one might also say the winner is an overall greater differentiation of the global economy, a fact aptly expressed in the diminished weight of the G7 and the rise of the G20. That in turn does not mean that historically older regions in the global capitalist system, such as Europe, will be confined to the backyards of future developments. Western and Central Europe will continue to stand as one of the most prosperous regions in the world. Many of the emerging economies will have to go a long way, of several decades at least, before they reach European levels in terms of the breadth and diffusion of internal economic and social development. But there is also one particular role that more mature regions such as Europe may be able to play. Although lagging behind in growth rates, they may lead the way in the qualitative transformation of modern societies in general and of market capitalism in particular. Indeed, it may be called the European mission to explore the possibility of a capitalism without growth, that is, without significant increases in per capita gross domestic product over a longer period of time. Actually, it may very well be argued that Europe has already entered that stage, and that it has to learn to redefine what it still in the older patterns perceives as a crisis and recession as truly a transformation and qualitative development. In principle and in a long-term historical perspective in particular, growth doesn't seem to be a necessary prerequisite for the existence of capitalism and market economies. It is important to remember that the particular obsession with growth, one might even say, that this particular obsession with growth in politics and public opinion is only a quite recent phenomenon, dating back to the post-war period of the 1950s and 1960s. What is more important than quantitative growth is the ability to constantly change, in the sense of innovation, of putting a premium on the new. Not so much growth will be the rallying cry of the future, but development. The direction of this kind of transformation, and therefore the major challenge for European societies in particular, is the shift towards sustainable modes of capitalism with regard to energy, water, and other resources. The next era of capitalism will be sustainable capitalism, not just with regard to ecological and environmental concerns, but also in terms of public expenditures and private lifestyles. The control of public debts, therefore, is as important to sustainable capitalism, that is, the search for clean and renewable energies. And one more thing is certain. The national framework of capitalism in which that system flourished in the 19th and largely the 20th centuries will continue to disappear. That doesn't mean, as Europeans used to believe for quite some time, that nation-states will vanish. In economic terms, however, and increasingly in social matters such as welfare and education, nation-states will lose their power to determine the rules of the game. Capitalism, however, cannot exist without an institutional framework of politics and legal regulation. That is why international cooperation in renegotiating these rules will become ever more important. That is why the G20 will have to play a decisive role in the future of capitalism. Thank you very much for your attention.
네, 놀테 교수의 주제 발표를 모두 들으셨습니다. 자, 놀테 교수께서는 금융위기 이후에 세계 경제와 또 자본주의가 어떻게 변화할 것인지, 또 G20 체제가 이런 변화에서 어떠한 역할을 하게 될 것인지 통찰력 있게 진단해 주셨습니다.
Thanks for Professor Nolte. Professor Nolte gave us sharp prognosis that how the world economy and capitalism will change after the global economic crisis and what role G20 will take in this moment of change.
네. 자, 그러면 놀테 교수의 주제 발표에 대해서 의견이 있으시거나 또 궁금증이 있으신 분들에 대해서 질의응답 세션을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 질문이 있으신 분들은 제자리에서 손을 들어주시기 바랍니다. 저희 진행 요원이 우선 마이크를 갖다 드릴 겁니다.
네. Now it's time for Q&A and discussion about Professor Nolte's special speech. If you have any questions or opinions, just raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone.
네, 지금 저기 형께서 질문을 해주시겠습니다.
예, 안녕하세요. 고려대학교 학생 이한월입니다. Good morning, Professor. So my question is, as a political scientist, how do you exactly diagnose the precise cause of the crisis in Southern Europe? And to follow up that question, how do you foresee the euro as a currency and the organization itself? Because there has been forecasts predicting that euro as a currency will disappear in about 5 years' time. And one last question is, you mentioned that capitalism only applies to countries in the stage of development and perhaps is no more effective than onwards. And do you see that hence as an indispensable side effect of capitalism? Thank you.
Do you see what as a?
Pardon me?
Can you repeat the last question? Can you repeat the last question, please?
You mentioned that capitalism applies only to countries in the stage of development and perhaps is no more effective to countries perhaps is already advanced. And so do you believe that hence is that an indispensable side effect of capitalism?
Yes. Thank you very much for the questions. I think I couldn't even start to talk about the causes of crisis in Southern Europe. First of all, because this is such a complex matter. Second of all, because you would need an economist, after all, to talk about this origins of the crisis in Southern Europe and not a political scientist or a historian. But certainly the origins of the crisis are in a mismatch between political and economic developments. Political development has progressed very quickly in European integration, and the development of the economy couldn't keep pace with that. The promise of political integration of Europe was also given as an economic promise, one might say, to peoples in less developed countries such as Spain or Portugal or Greece, giving them the promise that within quite a few years they might attain living standards as they had been able to see in France or Germany or the UK or the Scandinavian countries, but that couldn't possibly come true. And from the mismatch of these two factors, the economic and the political promises, I see the kind of the deeper, also the cultural roots of this crisis. Now, what is the consequence of this? The consequence, I'm very sure, will not be the disappearance of the euro as a currency. Although the euro as a currency is heavily under pressure now, it is my firm belief that the euro as a currency will stand, and that the difficulties will be overcome, not only for economic reasons, but mostly for political reasons. The euro must be understood as a political project, and as a political project, I'm sure it will be held firm by European governments under nearly all circumstances. What we've seen in the past few weeks, I think, supports my view. There's enormous effort put into strengthening the euro, and the political project of this European currency is too important to let it fail after just a decade. Which doesn't mean that thinking about the crisis and thinking about the euro has changed some minds of European politicians in recent weeks, and probably there's a lesson also, if you need it at all, there's a lesson also for the political and economic integration of East Asia. I think integration must come slowly and at a fair pace, in which economic and political integration go hand in hand, and therefore the euro, I'm sure, will stand, but the crisis of the euro will be a signal of warning to all other regions of the world considering going together with their currencies. The last question about capitalism in advanced countries, I mean not to be understood the way that capitalism doesn't play a role in advanced countries, only that it changes its face in advanced and more mature economies. I've tried to sketch out a cycle where the most dynamic region of capitalism kind of travels around the world, and it has been visiting Europe for a long period of time. It has been visiting the United States. Currently, this dynamic pioneer of capitalism is visiting East Asia, and as I've tried to sketch, it will probably travel on to other regions of the world, but that doesn't mean that capitalism and market societies will not further exist in other countries. They will take other forms in the transformation of manufacturing capitalism to service capitalism, for example, as we've seen sketched out in the previous keynote address this morning, in the transformation of capitalism from growth capitalism to a qualitative capitalism that is not as much dependent on growth rates, and that's exactly the type of capitalism I would argue that we're entering into, or have been entering into, in Europe. Many people in Europe, especially politicians in Europe, are still saying, oh, we have a crisis in the growth of the gross domestic product. We see a stagnation, and we have to return to growth rates of, say, 3 or 4 or 5% per year. But it is, in my perspective, very unlikely that capitalism in Europe will ever return to that model of growth. Only this wouldn't mean the end of capitalism, and that's perhaps something that is good to know for the future of Korea in, say, 2 or 3 decades also.
자, 여러분, 열정적인 강연과 또 깊은 통찰력을 보여주신 놀테 교수께 큰 박수를 부탁드립니다.
We'll finish Q&A time. To thank Professor Nolte, please give him a big applause once again.
네, 이상으로 제1세션을 모두 마치겠습니다.
Thank you. It's the end of the first session.